Welcome back to the Aubergine Chef. Today we'll be making something called Hawaiian Fog Ice Cream, which is a play on the name London Fog. Now if you know, London Fog is a beverage, it's Earl Grey tea, and it's usually made with a little bit of vanilla, but most importantly it's made with a little bit of milk. Now I was at home one day and I made some Earl Grey tea for myself. I didn't have any heavy cream on hand that I usually add to my tea, so I added some coconut milk, and I really liked the way it came out. Now I posted it on Facebook, and my friend Gwen Wright, who owns the blog Devour and Conquer, said I dubbed this Hawaiian Fog, and I love the idea. So I'm calling it Hawaiian Fog. Thanks, Gwen. Also, it turns into a really good ice cream. I decided, you know what, while I'm playing around with the flavors, why don't we try to make an ice cream out of it? And it worked really well, so I'm really excited to share this recipe with you guys. Now, if you know the difference between French-style ice cream and American-style ice cream, this is an American-style ice cream. And American-style ice creams tend to be a lot easier than French-style, because French-style usually has a cooked egg component, like a creme anglaise. Well, American-style is usually uncooked. There's a steep, sometimes you can steep, like we're going to do today, but the concept is it's uncooked. And so you're relying a lot on the fat and the cream and the milk to kind of give you the texture as opposed to egg yolks like you would in French-style ice cream. Now we're going to go over the ingredients real quick. On the stove, I have boiling, and it's like ready to go, of course. 10.5 ounces of heavy cream and 10.5 ounces of whole milk. And I use that to give it kind of the texture, because I think if you just use coconut milk, now some people like it just coconut milk, and there's nothing wrong with that. So if you want to play around with the ratios, go for it. But I don't really like it with just straight coconut milk, so I'm using a little bit of heavy cream and whole milk to kind of balance it out. Equal parts by weight of that. I also have in this bowl 10.5 ounces of coconut milk. Now you do want to use the canned coconut milk because it's a little bit thicker than the one that you find in cartons in the grocery store. Also, in the cartons in the grocery store sometimes have added stuff in it like sugars and flavors and stuff like that. And we're also going to add in, 7 ounces of granulated sugars on the stove, bring it to a boil, and a 1/4 teaspoon of salt is also coming to a boil with the heavy cream and the whole milk. And that's just going to make sure the sugar and the salt just basically get dissolved and well mixed, so you don't get chunks of sugar in your fluid or your liquid. And we're also going to add 1 1/4 ounces or 9 tablespoons of loose leaf Earl Grey tea. Now I'm using loose leaf because it has a nice flavor to it, and it's a little bit easier to measure out than if you use the bags. And I usually find the tea bags lose their flavor a lot more quickly than loose leaf tea. And I know that sounds like a lot, and that's because it is. And whenever you make ice cream, you always want to over-flavor your ice cream, because remember, you're eating it cold. And when you're eating something cold, your tongue, your mouth, everything gets cold. So it's very hard for your mouth to really taste flavor very well, so you want to make sure you enhance that by going a little bit overboard, so that way you don't have to work so hard to find that flavor. There's also a lot of fat in ice creams, especially French-style ice creams, and your mouth and your olfactory senses, they all have to compete with that fat. So you want to make sure that you always over-flavor it so you have a lot to go on. And it does sound like it's going to be pretty expensive, but you can usually get one of these large things at like a foreign food market for pretty inexpensive price. It's like basically buying tea in bulk. Now, if you don't use a lot of this tea, it can kind of become an issue. So kind of just plan things out. I don't expect you guys to go all crazy just for Earl Grey tea, but you can definitely use this as a template for anything you want. You don't really need to boil your milk and heavy cream for a long period of time. You just need to bring it to a boil so that sugar gets dissolved, so it's hot, and so the salt's also dissolved. And I know a lot of you tea connoisseurs out there are probably going to be very much better about knowing the exact temperature where to cook tea or where to steep tea. So definitely use that knowledge if you have it, but this works just fine for me. Now, I always find that Earl Grey tea has a very delicate flavor. If you let it steep for even just a little bit too long, it gets bitter super quickly, has a weird bitter aftertaste. So I usually steep it for a very short period of time. And so going by that, you really don't want to flavor your tea or flavor your liquid stronger with tea by steeping it longer, because you're going to make it bitter. So what you do is you add more tea. Now, it sounds kind of wasteful, but that's kind of just how it works. Now, fortunately, if it was just water, you could steep your tea a second time, a third time, or whatnot, and still get a pretty similar strength and flavor. But because we're using milk, it's pretty much a done deal unless you do it in milk again. So we're going to go ahead and add in our 1 1/4 ounces of loose leaf tea. Stir that in. It's going to get a nice natural color from it, like almost like a beige greenish color, which is kind of cool. Of course, you're going to add food coloring if you want, but you don't have to do that. Okay, and then just after a minute, like just literally like a minute, just go ahead and steep that right into your coconut milk. The reason I don't cook the coconut milk on the stove is not because you can't cook the coconut milk, but that way it kind of helps cool down the liquid a little bit faster. So that way not everything was on the stove. Okay, and then we're just going to whisk this together until everything is nice and mixed well. And then we're going to chill it for about 30 minutes or so, just basically until it's cold enough to put into our ice cream maker. And again, before I put it in the freezer, this is a great time to talk about, you can taste it now, see if you like where the sugar is, because it's still hot, so you can add more sugar. If it seems a little bit too sweet, you can add a little bit of salt if you want to kind of balance it out, or just make a note for the next time that you make it that you want to use a little bit less sugar. And of course, again, you can use this as a template. Any of the sugar or any of the tea that you want to substitute out for your kind of tea or herbal tea or whatever works really, really well. You may have to adjust the amount depending on what kind of tea you have, but it should work pretty well as a starting template. And again, you can adjust the liquids as well. If you don't want to use heavy cream or whole milk, if you don't want to use as much of them, you can play around with them as well. Okay, so once your mixture cools off in the refrigerator or freezer, so basically it's chilled, you can go ahead and put it into your ice cream maker. Now, if you watched some of my older episodes, you may have noticed that I used a KitchenAid ice cream maker attachment. This one's actually a Cuisinart that I got for, I think it was Christmas. It might have been I think it was my birthday, not too long ago. And I actually really, really like it. It came with 2 bowls, so I don't have to, keep freezing the same bowl. If I want to make 2 batches of ice cream, I can just use the one. Of course, now I can make 3 because I have the KitchenAid one. And it's just a lot easier to use, I think, than the KitchenAid. It seems really simple. Honestly, it's fine. You can use either one or whatever ice cream maker that you have. So what's going on is this white part right here. That's called the dasher, and what that does is it basically mixes it. It's kind of like the paddle or the whip attachment on your mixer. Then, of course, there's the freezer bowl, which is spinning around, and that's what we froze in the refrigerator for about 15 hours. In the freezer for about 15 hours or overnight, so that way it's good and frozen. And it's supposed to be colder than just like regular ice, but it's only going to be as cold as your freezer goes. So the idea is that you pour your liquid in, your chilled liquid, into the freezer bowl, and it starts freezing right away. So you want to get it onto the mixer or whatever the attachment is, so that way it's not sitting there freezing in the bowl into one solid chunk. So what the dasher is doing is not only mixing it, but it's also incorporating air. So you may notice that your ice cream or your sorbet or whatever you put in there actually grows in volume, and that's because air is getting mixed in, and that's called overrun. It's the amount of air that you put in, or the amount that is larger than the original base by volume. And air is really, really good in ice cream because it gives it a nice texture to it. There are some other recipes. I think gelato has less air and more fat, but generally speaking, air is a good thing. And so we're going to go ahead and let this freeze and mix for about 15 to 30 minutes, basically until it's nice and thick and looks like soft-serve ice cream. And a lot of times if you have a mixer, it starts to click a little bit. That's when you know it's having a hard time stirring, and that's usually about time you take it off. All right, so if you can see in there, you can see that the ice cream has kind of puffed up a little bit. That's the overrun I was talking about. But you can also see it's starting to form that nice texture because the ice crystals are getting mixed around and being controlled as they freeze. Kind of like if you were doing chocolate, tempering chocolate. You're controlling the way those fat crystals are being formed. Here you're controlling how the ice crystals are being formed. So you're forming ice crystals, but there's lots of tiny ones. So that way they're not these big solid chunks. You get a nice more creamier mouthfeel. And so it's pretty close to being done. It's probably going to be about another 5-10 minutes on the mixer. And then we're going to take it off and put it into our containers to put into the freezer. Okay, so we're ready to take our ice cream off the mixer. Basically, the longer you have it on the mixing bowl, or however you want to call it, the more air will be mixed into it. And so generally speaking, the softer it will be, especially in terms of texture, the more delicate it will be, less icy. Because the crystals are getting smaller and smaller, and there's going to be more and more air in it. That's just a general term. It may not always work exactly that way. Okay, and so the texture should be similar to soft serve ice cream. It should be slightly soupy, but not like watery soupy. You should still be able to scoop it with like a ladle, but it shouldn't be so soupy that you could almost pour it out. You should be able to scoop it. It should hold its shape like that. Okay, and so I'm going to fill these up. Okay, I got about a quart in there. I could probably get another quarter quart in there or whatever, but I'm not going to worry about that. I'm going to put a piece of parchment paper touching the surface of the ice cream, so that way no ice crystals form on the top. None of those big chunky ones like from condensation. I put a little bit in the coconut shell for later, so when I take pictures of it, it'll be a little bit elevated, so that way I don't have to put a whole bunch of scoops in there. And I'm going to freeze them both. And we're going to freeze them for about 2 to 4 hours. 4 hours is probably the best, so that way they're nice and solid, so that we can scoop it. But generally, again, the longer you keep it on here, the more ice crystals are going to form that are nice and small, the more air gets in there, rather than just freezing it straight in here will turn into a solid block. And before I forget, do you remember this was on top of here like this? This hole right down here in the middle is perfect for pouring stuff into it or adding your mix-ins right at the very end. You want to do that the very last thing, so that way it just gets barely mixed in and it doesn't cut up your bowl or your dasher. Okay, so it's been about 4 hours. So we can take a look at our ice cream and see if it's gotten nice and firm. It looks like we're good to go. It's actually got a nice firm but soft consistency, so it's good to scoop. I hate scooping super hard ice cream, you know? So, I'll put that in the coconut that I prepared. Hopefully the pictures will come out nice. And you can see a lot of the texture has to do with sugar. And the more sugar that's in something, the less it's going to freeze. So that's why if you put too much sugar in your sorbet, it doesn't freeze. It just gets to be a really cold liquid. The other thing that freezes or inhibits freezing is fat, but not so much as sugar. And the final thing that helps with inhibiting freezing is alcohol. So you could actually put a splash of rum in here, for example, and that'll help control the freezing consistency as well. Now, I fully expect this ice cream to actually get harder if it sits out in the freezer for longer than 4 hours. So I'm not super thinking that this is the final consistency, because it should be a little bit harder than this. But it's a nice consistency for scooping, so that way I get some nice scoops for some pictures later. Alright, so that's how you make the Hawaiian fog ice cream. Remember that this ice cream is an American-style ice cream, which means it doesn't contain a cooked egg component like French ice cream does or French-style ice cream does, and that you can substitute basically any tea that you'd like for the Earl Grey tea. And again, I do recommend using loose-leaf tea because I feel like it does have a better taste to it. Now, if you do have a bagged tea that has a really good flavor, or if you bag your own tea, then obviously it's going to have a little bit better flavor than the average tea bag. But I do prefer a loose leaf tea, and it also makes it easier to measure, because then you don't have to cut open those bags. Because remember, I didn't weigh out any bags since I used loose leaf tea. So you want to keep that in mind as well. Also keep in mind the 3 inhibitors for freezing is fat, sugar, and alcohol. With fat making it a little bit more creamier, sugar definitely preventing ice crystals from forming, alcohol also preventing ice crystals from forming. With alcohol being the strongest inhibitor to freezing. Now, that being said, you could add like a splash of coconut rum or dark rum or amaretto even to the ice cream, and it should still freeze okay. If you have some issues with it not freezing well, try to reduce some of the heavy cream or even some of the sugar, and then that way the alcohol will replace some of their anti-freezing measures, and that way you have a nicer balance. So feel free to play around with the ratios. Nothing is set, and that's one of the fun things about ice cream, is that you can play around with the ratios until you find your perfect mix. So I hope you learned a lot today. Thank you for watching, and remember, the Aubergine Chef, demystifying dessert one recipe at a time.